shout outs. I want to give a shout out and recognize our gold level sponsors and hire for Startup Sack, Nivigent and SMUD. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So I don't think we have anybody from those two organizations here, but if they are, thank you guys. We appreciate it. And
Mhm.
without further ado, I would like to kick things off to Jake. So let me find my notes. So Jake is the co-founder and CEO of Bitwise. And so welcome, Jake. I thought we'd start off first of all by having you introduce yourself with your background, talk about what Bitwise is, what Bitwise does, what its mission is, along with the origin story of how you and Irma saw what need you saw and how you started it.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks so much for having me. Have been looking forward to joining. So Bitwise was founded by myself and Irma Olguin in Fresno, California in 2013. I do think our stories are helpful to understanding the heart and the why to the work that we do. So we both grew up here. This was home for us, but squarely on opposite sides of the track. So Irma grew up in Carruthers, which is a farming town to the south and west of Fresno. Grew up with her family doing field work, and that was very much her vision for her life. Meanwhile, I grew up on the exact opposite end of the county in a place called Clovis, if any of you are familiar with Fresno, which is a more privileged suburb, and was sort of assumed from birth that I would go to school and I would have wonderful opportunities. I just was sort of a generation further removed from the immigrant story, from the struggle of poverty. And so that was our starting context. Sacramento is not far from Fresno, but the context of Fresno being a large, poor city with a something of a self-installed ceiling for itself is very much a part of our story. Irma and I didn't know one another growing up, and in very, very different stories, we wound up leaving Fresno for college and bounced around the country, gaining education and experience before both very intentionally choosing to come back to Fresno. And Irma as an engineer and entrepreneur, me as an intellectual property attorney. And both came back with two sort of like hopes, I think, for the city. One was, I think, broadly described as justice, this desire to see more indifferent people invited to the party. And the other was the hope for a vibrant economy in our city. We didn't believe that the sort of status quo in Fresno had to be the limit. We didn't believe that that was the best we could do. But we didn't have some grand plan at that moment in time. So we came back, dug in, as I say, Irma as an engineer and entrepreneur, me as an intellectual property attorney. That is the context in which we met, and started to become friends. And before long found ourselves sort of digging into the question of how we could use this industry that we're looking at. So the technology industry was central to both of our careers in different ways, and it was obviously creating profound opportunity for many, and very, very specifically not creating any opportunity for most. And how could we use that to change the story arc in Fresno, to transform our city? And fundamentally what that meant is how can we connect more people to the sort of prosperity that the technology industry offers, such that they can pay their bills, afford a proper house, right? They can live the sort of life they might have thought out of reach. And such that they in their aggregate could have a transformative effect on the macro of our economy. And so then as now, what became apparent to us as we're three sort of missing pieces to that puzzle. And that makes up what Bitwise does today. The first is workforce. We teach people technical skills. They need to access this opportunity. And I think the non-obvious component to that is that for anybody that is familiar with the story of poverty, it's not JavaScript that you're intimidated with. It is you don't have a way to get to class or childcare or access to quality healthcare or housing, food stability, compensation while you're sort of spending time learning. And so we said if we could couple that with technical education, we could access brilliance that all too often gets overlooked or underestimated. And so that was the first piece of the puzzle. We wanted to teach people the skills they needed to access that opportunity. The second is that we wanted to model what it looked like to build a great company of and with those folks. And so we built a technology consulting practice within Bitwise, where the majority of our technical talent, we were hiring straight out of our workforce programs, such that we could prove to the world, it's not, here's this lofty idea of what it might look like to build a representative workforce in your city. It is, here are the results we're driving in utilizing that talent, in saying that we believe so deeply in it, that that's where we're going to put all of our chips. And ultimately, the idea was that that would be an accelerant to others consuming that talent. And so that was the second piece of the puzzle. And the third is how we tie the work out to place. And so we, pretty aggressive real estate developer, we actually acquire blighted real estate at the center of the cities we serve, beginning in Fresno, and then develop it as technology hubs where our firms, our technology companies, and others can co-locate alongside the workforce programs, create vibrant community where it becomes obvious, where as a student that is engaging with the technology industry for the first time, where you might find community, or where you might find this mentor or a job opportunity or whatever it may be. And that becomes the envelope for all of this work, and how it becomes deeply rooted in place. How we make sure that we're not training you up such that you sort of launch off into Sacramento and pay taxes, buy houses, send your kids to school there. We want you to find the sort of career you've dreamt about in the city that you're in. And so those three pieces make up sort of the ecosystem approach of Bitwise, and feels something of a long ways from that starting line many years ago. And we've gotten to do a lot of really, really exciting things, but born of a deep love of our city, and was very narrowly focused on it when we began.
So maybe talk a little bit about the societal impact that you've seen. I think you said 2013 is when you launched.
Right.
So maybe talk about, I mean, what were some of the early societal, social impacts that you saw, and how those evolved over time? I'm sure the impact has just grown over time as you've gotten bigger. What are some of the powerful stories that you've seen there?
Yeah, I think that they express themselves in each of the different areas, and unequivocally, the most impactful thing that we do happens at a micro level. And so at the heart of our model is tech apprenticeships. And what we're saying there, fundamentally, stripping away the buzzword, is that we believe the way you actually are able to connect folks to opportunity that sort of systemically has been out of reach is you pay them to learn. And so we operate today what is probably the largest tech apprenticeship program in the United States. And when we started that work, second year of Bitwise, so going from just instructional to apprenticeship, where folks are attaching to real world scopes of work and they're being paid to learn, they're with us full time for this. We didn't have a funding model. we didn't have an idea about how that would ultimately become profitable. We just knew that was an essential sort of step. And we couple folks into groups of 8. They're cohorts that are usually with us for 6 to 12 months. And I remember that first cohort sitting there in a room in our first facility, throwing names on a whiteboard. And the non-obvious piece of that is that we don't view apprenticeship as particularly our apprenticeship, as the tool for the person who's going to make it anyway. We don't want you to sort of be leaving our courses and have an obvious track to a job and say, no, wait a little while longer and participate in our apprenticeship program. Is who actually needs that last bridge? Who can benefit most from this leg of the journey? And so getting to throw names up of folks that we thought were worthy candidates, and then watch that first group of 8 dig in and have that apprenticeship paycheck be maybe the largest they'd ever received. And then watching those folks land their first job after that. And then now fast forward 6 or so years from that time, and to see, a story that pops to mind is my friend Arturo Ceballos, who was in that very first cohort. And Arturo goes from, I remember his first HTML website, and it was nothing to write home about. But to today, he has one startup under his belt. He leads a large team in the organization where he works. And not only is this somebody who's enjoying a higher level of economic attainment, he's investing in local real estate. And so that wild sort of journey that would not have been a part of his inevitable story, but should have been, getting to observe that. And so at the human element, now multiply that out the thousands of times now that we've been able to serve people, and the macro of that begins to be quite big. And you begin to think about, okay, so what is the number at which the entire regional economy sort of tips over? And that's the exciting math that we think about a lot today.
And so, boy, so many questions. So you kind of did that teach a man to fish kind of a thing, and instead of just giving him the fish, and so he's been able to turn around, and others have been able to turn around and have a positive impact on the Fresno economy and community. Have you seen measurable metrics or things that are moving that economy in a positive way due to all these people going out and doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, we were founded in 2013, which, if you remember, was the depths of the recession here in Fresno, the prior recession, and so I'm pleased to report that Bitwise fixed it. We fixed that recession, and no, I'm only kidding. The economy certainly has grown, and what we know today, there is admittedly some disconnects in the data set, but what we know is that the sort of growth that we're seeing, job growth, and specifically when you slice that by sector in Fresno, owes quite a lot to the growth of the technology sector here in Fresno. And the belief is, and it's still, I would say, a working estimate, that the work of Bitwise has contributed greater than 1% to the overall GDP of Fresno. That is pretty profound. And then, on the other side of the coin, it's still just 1%. And so, but it's hopeful, I think, in terms of, if you look at the relative size of the investment and the period of time for what might be possible when you activate folks for a career in the tech economy. And there's so Brookings has come and studied our work some, and one of the really exciting things that I think points to this as the right work when you think about economic development we call them underdog cities. In an underdog city, every time you fill a technical role, their conclusion was that creates a ripple effect, or a halo effect, of 4.3 other jobs in the regional economy. And so that sort of multiplier is precisely the spot where cities like Fresno so desperately need to focus. The data suggests that has been borne out in Fresno, and you're beginning to see it, right? I will admit that in a COVID world, downtown Fresno is something of a place to me, because you care about it so deeply, and like all the things are there, but the people aren't. Right. And so it is a sad moment, but downtown looks profoundly different than it did when we began. Been able to be a part of catalyzing federal investment dollars that have made infrastructural investments in downtown Fresno. We have 250,000 square feet of technology space in downtown Fresno, where there was zero to begin with. Hundreds of technology companies call it home. And so that all is really, really exciting to see. And so you can see the progress, which I think paints an exciting picture about what is possible in front of us. And it sort of makes really clear just how profound the need was at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to shift a little bit to you mentioned your funding model earlier on, and I know a question that's got to be on a lot of people's mind is, you raised, I think, $27 million in a Series A. You are a social impact company. I think there's got to be an interesting story there. I mean, most VCs don't invest in that kind of a business. So what's the background behind how that investment came about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the conventional wisdom around raising capital, so okay, you must live in San Francisco, you must be able to describe your company in 3 sentences, you must have gone to Stanford or Cal, you must be tall, white, and male, you must. Like, we don't fit any of them, and I am 6 foot tall, a little bit white and male, but Irma is very much not those things, and so. I think every form of friction that you might be able to imagine in fundraising, we experienced. I mean, we never had an ambition of going out and raising venture capital, but somewhere around year 3 or 4 in our story, it became clear that the traction we were experiencing was unique, and what that led to was a lot of inbound interest from other cities. about, well, hey, would you ever consider doing this here? And the answer was squarely no. I'm sorry, we've got sort of blinders on to Fresno. But then two things became really clear. Our sort of like pithy internal response was, why don't you just do it yourself? Like, this is obvious. And then I think what became clear was that what we'd come upon really was special, and the approach had nuance, and could have real value to other cities with whom it wasn't hard for us to empathize, places that it wasn't hard for us to care about. And also the realization that being in a broader set of geographies could really open up the Pandora's box of resources with which to do this work. And so we articulated a strategy to expand to three additional cities, and went out to raise a Series A. And that's generous, though. We said we wanted to go raise money, and we were sitting in a pitch meeting in San Francisco with folks who knew far more about the work of fundraising than us, really doing our very best to communicate this grand vision and hope and all of the rest. And they sort of finish, and they're like, they say, so you're raising your Series A. Irma and I sort of look at each other, and that is literally the moment at which we learned the word Series A. And so is it? Yeah, it's a Series A. And like that's very, very consistent with our fundraising journey, particularly during that Series A raise. We learned as we went. It wasn't all sort of butterflies and roses. It took 18 months to raise our Series A. Literally almost died trying. And what we encountered were, as I say, every form of friction. You know, we've got this company that has a complicated model. I think the outcome is self-evidently good, but I mean, I imagine many on this call are still wondering, so how do these guys make money? And so you have that initial hurdle. You have the hurdle of, we've got no experience fundraising prior, and you have this reality that is really insidious at its core, and that is that you get a lot of, particularly now coming out of 2020, all of this talk of social impact and racial equity that needs to sort of be required as we think about creating a tech economy. And you know, to be blunt, it really is mostly just talk, very little action, very little understanding, and it's borne out in the reality that when you get to the meeting and you've gotten there because you're a social impact company and because you communicate this really wonderful mission and these outcomes, but the questions are identical to if you weren't. And the difficulty that creates is that the bar for being a social impact company, many people will view it as it's concessionary, right? So you get a discount on what you need to be producing in the way of commercial results because you're doing good in the world. The reality is you've just signed up for another task in diligence. You've signed up to not only prove that you are delivering venture returns, so doubling revenue year over year, but you have also signed up to prove that you're saving the world while doing it. The reality is that in any venture meeting, they're looking for you to be wrong. They're looking for you to have missed a step and to prove that you're not worthy of the investment. And so it just gives them more targets to aim at. And the number of meetings we sat in where very clearly Irma and Jake, co-founders, and the meeting is, hi Irma, nice to meet you. And then 90 minutes of Jake. Many of them really don't know how to talk to brown people. And so the stories just go on and on and on, where the deck is stacked against anybody that doesn't fit that conventional mold. As I say, it just took an age for us to get over that line. But in so doing, it opened up some really helpful resource. And as I was sharing with you, now we're getting to this point where, you know, we've raised quite a lot of money, and it feels like in some ways, within Impact, we're one of the horses that the world said, okay, we'll bet on that. And so Irma and I do look at each other and say, man, we better not screw this up. Because it does feel a lot like people want to say, well, we told you that wouldn't work. Impact is not the way. We had it figured out before. When very squarely the argument we're making is that social impact is not optional. The world is broken because you weren't thinking about that all along.
So you mentioned you got the Series A, which enabled you to expand to other cities, and I think Bakersfield and Merced and Oakland. I'm curious, what were the decision criteria that led to those particular cities? And I'm kind of curious. I'm sure others here are too. If you've looked at Sacramento and evaluated whether Sacramento would be a good fit for your program.
Yeah, so that is the right list of the initial cities, and we had sort of a hypothesis around. We called it a playbook internally. What would make a city one that was right for Bitwise, and I think it's really important to clarify a couple of things in that. It is we're not gating for Palo Alto, right? We're not trying to distill for this is a place with all of the things. Everything is working. It's well served. It would be comfortable, safe, and luxurious sort of for us. We're in many respects looking for the opposite. We're looking for a city with the sort of economic reality and economic challenges that feel familiar to those that we've confronted in Fresno. So one of the things that we look really closely at is per capita income. We want to see a per capita income of less than $30,000. We want to see a population of between 250,000 and 2 million in the metro area. We want to see perhaps some evidence of technology life, but if the technology industry is flourishing, it might be the wrong point in the story for us to enter in. We want to see an obviously sort of folks that were left out of the party because it gives us real clear direction with where you focus and on and on. So many times the more negative answer to the things that we're measuring suggests that that's a city that we're well suited to serve. With the selection of the first three cities, it didn't feel as though we're not selling an app to the world to where we have 1,000 customers. You get a couple wrong that leave angrily and sort of give you a bad review. You'll live to fight another day. Bitwise goes out and expands to 3 cities, and we just really blew it in Bakersfield. Didn't feel like that was a loss we could afford. And so what that meant is that it was really, really tightly premised on where relationships opened up, where we were encountering people as we dug in and explored a city. That it felt like they wanted us there. It felt like they wanted us to be a part of their story. I mean, growing up in Fresno, there's no shortage of folks that have sort of wandered in on a white horse with all of the answers. We're going to fix everything. I'm reminded of ideas about we're going to build a river through downtown Fresno, or we're going to move downtown to River Park, which is the north end of our town. It's very sort of urban sprawl suburbia, and all these ideas, and this will save everything, and it's an outsider promising that, and then it falls flat. And so you're trained to be wary of outsiders with big promises. And so our approach was, where can we go and say, like, with humility, like, hey, we get that emotion. Here's the set of things that we do. Here's our story. We'd love to know your story, and then we'd love to know whether you think we fit in it. Do you think this would work here? Do you think this would be helpful here? And so that was our process. And we're really fortunate to find unique and different inroads to each in Bakersfield, Merced, and Oakland. And to your question about Sacramento, it's always been a city of interest for us. Sacramento is interesting in that it feels like it isn't any one thing, right? You've got so many different segments of the city that some of them feel very, very prime for something like a Bitwise model to serve well. West Sacramento comes to mind. And then you've got downtown Sacramento, where it's like, man, this place is awesome. Like, it doesn't nuts. And so it has, for us, it's never felt like the right time, but we're really, fond of saying that there's only 2 possible answers when we explore cities. One is yes, and one is not right now. And unless you're Palo Alto, then it's no. That has been our experience. But we have team members there. We do quite a lot of work with the state government and even some companies there in Sacramento. And so it's a place that we're really fond of and look forward to digging in sort of more over time.
Awesome. So I've got a bunch more questions, but I want to make sure that we give others in the audience a chance to ask questions. So I think I want to start opening it up to the audience. So Laura, are you still here to help me?
Yes.
get people in. So if anybody has a question, the best way to do it is, you've probably all been in Zoom. There's a way to raise your Zoom hand. You can do that, or as a second option, type it into the chat. But if anybody has a question for Jake, let's go ahead and, oh, we already have one from Luciano. How far along were you in terms of traction before getting investment? And how did you arrive at these 8 investors led by Kapoor Capital?
Yeah, it's a good question. We were we were insanely far along. The Silicon Valley is a very weird place, and the irony of that is I'm talking about Silicon Valley when I'm talking about venture. We raised almost no money from Silicon Valley proper. We showed up with Bitwise at nearly $20 million in annual revenue and doubling annually. And they were like, "What took you so long? I don't know what to do with you. You were supposed to come when you, had an idea and had just landed your first customer." And so, but what it communicates is that we had a hammer and wrench in our sort of toolkit. We didn't have venture. That wasn't one of the things that we knew how to use. And so we were really, really far along, which has had its ultimately benefits and its detriments. As a benefit, there wasn't any question of whether this thing could make money and generate revenue and grow and that sort of thing. As a detriment, we didn't ever build it for venture. And venture doesn't just want to invest in what you're building. They want you to build what you're building in their model and to track things the way they track them in the same rows and columns. And so what the result of is waiting so long to raise is that we had quite a lot of history where we weren't paying any attention to what they might like. And then in terms of tracking to the investors that we did, we got insanely lucky. And in that we would have taken money from any drug dealer that was willing to give it to us. We're not choosy, 18 months and you're sort of growing at a speed you can't afford tomorrow. But what became really clear is we had a number of sort of sages along the way that sort of gently pointed us in the right direction. One of those relationships, we actually spoke at an event that was hosted by Code for America in San Francisco, and they were like, "Oh, you need to meet Mitch and Frida Kapor." We thought, that sounds great. We've heard of them. We know they invest. Where do they live? We'll go now. And we got introduced. So this is probably about 8 months into our raise. We got introduced, and Mitch and Frida emailed back promptly. They said, "This is really interesting. We'd love to meet. We're going to go spend the summer on the East Coast. We'd love to talk with you in September." And we're like, "Great." And then we spent the summer trying and failing at raising a Series A. They got back and accepted the meeting and immediately dug in. There was an emotional connection between their work and ours, and they very quickly flew down to Fresno, where I promptly spent the day in the emergency room with my youngest, and Irma pitched them and showed them around. So it was a wandering story, but there's an important note, and I think the takeaway is you sort of will get a sense of who your people are, like who the folks that get what you're doing and are the right individuals to be investors. They're the folks you would have if you wishing made it so. For us, that was the Kapors, and so we locked on. The Kapor doesn't lead Series A's. They're a seed investor. But by locking on and building a relationship of trust, we wound up in this spot where we were in this situation of do we have enough to close? Do we have the right investors around the table? And we had an investor who had accepted their lead term sheet, who was sort of dragging their feet. They wanted to have a white glove, Sand Hill Road firm sign on with them, and we just couldn't get them to move. And they kept sort of moving the goalpost. So we're sitting in a meeting, and they sort of moved the goalpost again. And Mitch Kapor, I love him for it. So they had said something to the effect of, I know that they want to close, but they're not the lead investor. Stands up, might as well have flipped over the table and said, that's it. Let's go. I'm leading this. And he and Frida led our Series A and have been extraordinary investors and partners for us since then. And then what you do is by finding somebody and you say, okay, this person sort of in their bones gets what I'm trying to do. If I had my if I had my pick of investors, this is who I choose, and then mind their network, right? And so it becomes this game of telephone getting introduced to the next person, and what that did, because we sort of serendipitously wound up with this wonderful set of people in Capor, in New Voices, in Acumen, we kept getting introduced to good people. And our Series A, despite having taken 1 million years to raise, wound up full of folks who are deeply aligned to our work in a way that has served us really, really well.
I think that's probably a really great takeaway for anybody looking to raise money is alignment with the VC's investment thesis and values. I think
I would bolt onto that some. There are infinity investors, literally infinity. One of the things that took us too long to learn is trying to convince people who were totally uninterested in investing in Bitwise that they were. I'm not sure we've ever changed anybody's mind. If I was to change anything about our approach in that Series A, if first meeting didn't go well, I'm not interested in a second meeting. Only for us, we were, and we took the 18th meeting in which they still weren't interested in investing.
Javier, you've got the next question.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear.
All right, great. So I was wondering, in terms of the technical training that Bitwise provides, is that curriculum developed in-house, or do you work with other companies to provide that training?
Yeah, it's a good question. So 100% home-baked. So we, our program was designed by our president, Bethany Milley, who came out of education. And our belief was really that we needed to develop a model that was learning by doing and deeply, deeply steeped in empathy. And what that meant is we need to close the cycle between, or the period of time between somebody learning and somebody teaching. Because when you talk about teaching communities that historically have not been invited to the party, I'm going to do a poor job of empathizing what it feels like to not know in the way that they don't know. But Joe, Susie, Juan, who just came through the program and is from that community, being empowered as the teacher, not only understands the content, but also understands the story that the person is bringing to the class. And so our model for empowering instructors really quickly is perhaps one of the most powerful parts of it. But yeah, all homegrown.
Laura, who's got the next question? You've got your hand up.
Jay.
Jay?
Hi. I'm thinking about incorporating my business, and I was wondering, do generally companies raise better fundings and they have more opportunities if they incorporate in Silicon Valley and San Francisco? And what do you think about it?
Yeah, so it's a good question that we got wrong. The less city-oriented, more state-oriented, almost certainly, and there are exceptions, but almost certainly venture firms, family offices are not going to invest in LLC. And almost certainly their preference is going to be a Delaware C corporation. That being said, getting started, my recommendation would not be to run out and form a Delaware C corporation. The recommendation would be to, depending on what you're doing, what serves you well in the early days, and be thinking about a pathway to conversion to a Delaware C corporation when you do raise. So my state is the key.
Laura, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. So one of the things that Jeff and I often ponder here in Sacramento is how we can get high wealth individuals to invest in our entrepreneurial community, really as a way of almost philanthropic investment, that they realize they're not just making a decision based on return on investment, they're investing in the startup community because of the long-term impact on economic growth. So my question is, have you cracked that nut in Fresno? Do you have high wealth individuals who are supporting the work of both Bitwise as well as startups that may be coming out of the Fresno region as well?
Yeah, cracked that nut systemically, I don't think so. But I'll share with you what we've seen work. And so again, I said we've been unsuccessful in causing venture firms to change their mind. I think similarly, we have been unsuccessful in getting high net worth individuals, and in this space, in investing, really the target is family offices, to care about new stuff. What that means is the task has been, so the obvious alignment, people from Sacramento, but that's not helpful or new. The focus would be, okay, so let's say your target set of billionaires, they're in their Venn diagram. It just so happens that 7 of them are investing in clean tech. And the thing that's going to be most successful in getting them to invest in a Sacramento company is going to be putting clean tech opportunities in front of that set of folks, and good ones. And once you get something that sticks, that then, it's a bit like, I might not care about your neighborhood before we're friends, but we become friends and I start coming over to your house. I want to see your neighborhood do well. That's a cool place. I've seen it. I hang out over there sometimes. I would say similarly here, right? Once you have that high net worth individual, that family office that's invested in a local company, they care about that company, and then they care about the broader ecosystem around that company. And so it's a means of dragging them back and introducing them to the other things and people and companies of that community. And that for us has actually been successful. We have seen the folks that have invested in Bitwise follow on in both philanthropic and equity investments in the communities we serve. And they've been excited to do so. And so that is, it has opened up those opportunities. And I will say for places like Sacramento, Fresno, Bakersfield, you have these secondary and tertiary markets. The family offices are a really, really fertile ground. They are this like hidden sort of secret where we store all of American wealth. It is baffling, and I couldn't have told you what a family office was before we began raising our Series A. But that's where you're getting to strip away some of the, and probably this is familiar to some, but to strip away some of that mystery. A family office is the vehicle by which uber wealthy families deploy capital. And historically, they were deploying capital primarily into funds, in public markets, so that other professionals invested their money for them. More recently, the approach has been to make direct investments. So they're building their own investment teams that are sourcing deals, evaluating deals. And what happens is the decision-making structure is pretty singular. You have a family member who says, this is what I care about. And if you fall in that category, the process can almost always be atypical. They can move quickly and be nimble and those sorts of things. So I think, to be direct about that question, find something that they care about before you ever showed up. In Sacramento, take that to them, and then that becomes an avenue for them to see a broader set of things in your city.
It's back to the alignment issue again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It looks like we have a hand raised. Luciano has his hand raised. Luciano?
Thank you, Jake. Really appreciate your insights. Mine is a question back to your fundraise. How did you arrive at converging at a valuation and kind of the terms? Any challenges to watch out for, such as, what instruments to use, not use? I'm just kind of curious as to how you kind of arrived at a valuation, what instruments, and any insights.
Yeah, this is a spot where Irma and I are not going to give you the textbook advice because we are more interested in doing the work than we are in owning all of it. And so, you know, if I'm being really direct, like we took a deal that was sub-market for our valuation because it was more important to us to have that capital to grow the company than it was to own all of the company. And so we didn't take a Silicon Valley valuation, meaning like you're talking about 10x and those sorts of things. And so how we arrived at that was the scientific process of taking whatever they gave us. And we took a really bad valuation and we sort of got trapped into that, despite the fact that the firm that articulated that really bad valuation, very predatory, didn't wind up investing. We just got to the end of the road and everybody had signed on to that term sheet and we're sort of stuck. And that's not a gripe. It's just to say, like, the idea of here's how you should think about valuation, and like you want to make sure that you hold on to this and that and the other thing. It's pretty privileged advice. And when you live in a city where you know, all of 0 people have raised venture capital before you, and you've got a company that is, you know, a little bit strange in its approach, you don't have that privilege, and we didn't. Now, I will say in subsequent priced rounds, our power went up considerably. And a note that is helpful, perhaps, the ownership and valuation does not need to be tied to control. And so Irma and I were able to, thanks exclusively to the guidance of Mitch and Frida, and working to their own detriment in terms of control, we retained majority voting control of the company without retaining majority ownership of the company. And so that nuance is important to us, particularly when I said, right, we care about doing the work and doing it well more than we care about owning 100% of it.
Arlene, I think you're up next.
Okay, thank you. Do you have outreach or partnerships with the local high schools or community colleges or Fresno State?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We have really deep relationships with each of those folks. We are squarely an adult educator, right? So the K-12 space is sort of a land that we got lost long ago. Like, that wasn't our primary lane. It just is really saturated. And I think that the challenge there is that schools are really fond of making really exciting, innovative, different ideas the same as the other ideas. Like, how can we, as quickly as possible, make this innovative thing normal school? And that really wasn't our jam. So what we found, our relationships with schools are really, how can we be a bridge post-graduation? How can you feel a part of this community? And what are the programs that we can bridge out of, the folks who are interested in doing that K-12 work? Our most important partners in the educational system are unequivocally the community colleges, because they serve the student population that is thinking in vocational terms, for whom career or college is actually a live decision. And then we do have deep relationships too with Fresno State, Fresno Pacific, UC Merced, CSU Bakersfield, and other state universities. But there we tend to focus on where can we be sort of better together. So in Bakersfield, there's an innovation lab that we're readying to announce that is done in partnership with Bakersfield, CSU Bakersfield. And there, it was very clear that they had a bit of resource and knowledge to bring to the table. We had a bit of resource and knowledge to bring to the table, and it didn't require either of us to come off of our path and be different than we were in order to collaborate. And so that's the way we tend to work with the 4 years, but do a wide variety of other modes of interacting. The reality of our work is such that it really requires, or benefits from, I should say, broad community buy-in, and those are such influential actors in the communities that we serve, and they've done such good work in so many respects, that we want to be sort of wedded to each other for the success of that place. In another category of the business, so our technology consulting practice, we're today probably one of the fastest growing technology consulting practices in the United States. And we do quite a lot of government, large enterprise work. And the value proposition for many of our customers, particularly in the communities that we call home, is that you can buy your software, your technology in community in a way that way you don't only get the technology, you get the that wage to stay in Fresno, you get that wage to stay in Bakersfield. And so we can be an at-scale local provider. And so that is a way that we serve quite a lot of those folks, is that we become their tech consulting partner and get to build some really wonderful things with them. We don't work exclusively in the cities we are, but that's many times how we'll work with those educators.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Laura.
I was going to say, it looks like Javier. Is that a new question, Javier? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since Bitwise has kind of a unique business model, do you have any competitors, either direct or indirect?
Yeah, so you know, the punky answer is no, but you're never supposed to say that to venture capital. You always have a competitor. The reality for us is we are in a space that is really still being defined, and I would like, so much so to, you know, if you're in B2C SaaS or B2B SaaS or e-commerce, like, we sort of have a bucket for you. When we began, there wasn't really a bucket for the work that we're doing. Over the course of the last several years, some terminology has begun to form up, and I think that for us, we fall into this bucket of workforce as the spot that we sit. And there are some other folks in that bucket. So on the African continent, there's a firm called Andela that does some related work. Their model is different, but we're certainly endeavoring to do similar things. In Baltimore, there's a company called Catalyte that does some really, really interesting work. There's a company called Kinsey Academy, and headquartered out of Indianapolis, that falls in this category also. The reality is that sort of we play there, and then we play in the tech consulting space, which is so Pivotal, Microsoft, others would be competitors in that space. And we also play in this real estate space where we're creating Place, where you have the artist formerly known as WeWork would have been a competitor that would have pointed to, and on and on. The marriage of those three verticals into a unified solution is a spot where I think we're relatively alone, right? And so hard to identify an actor that's actually operating across all three verticals, although we do have competitors in each of the separate verticals.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Anybody just want to jump in or type a question in the
I
chat?
have another question.
Go, Laura.
So, so as I understand your story, and I've heard Irma speak before, first off, you started teaching people coding, and then like after you taught them how to code, it's like, okay, let's put them to work, and then your company that does contract development came out of that, and then other things have come out of that. What's next? What kind of business do you feel like you should create next to help support all of the people who are in your community?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there are a couple of answers to it. I mean, when we started, we used to talk about the difference between Salesforce and Amazon, and you're seeing Salesforce wrestle with this some now, as though Mark Benioff needs advice from me. Salesforce was a CRM, right? That is what they did. They did a really good job in owning that space. Whereas Amazon was a company that sells things. Like, that was it. Like, so they left themselves this really broad playing field. And so today, it's not at all surprising that Amazon is in drone technology, they're in e-commerce, they're in streaming video, they just sell things. And so if you can sell it, that's a business that you might find Amazon in someday. And so we did fancy Bitwise as something of a platform, a similar platform, in that we had these three core components, but they were broad enough that it allowed us to be nimble in meeting other gaps that we came to. And so I'd say today our work is in thinking more completely around the work that we can do in those categories. And so I'll give you an example. When we began, and just a note, literally day one Bitwise, all three things existed. We had a building, we had the tech consulting practice, we had the workforce programs. And let me be clear, Workforce programs were 12 people. Irma and I were related to 4. The website, the tech consulting practice was one website. That it was a $50,000 website that I sold for $4,000. And the building was this building in downtown Fresno that we all treasure. We called it Bitwise Mural District. I tell a brief story about the first time we walked through that building. Our third co-founder, John Dotson, dear friend, first investor in Bitwise. He knew we were looking for a building, and so we were touring them, and he said, I own a building in downtown Fresno, and you should come look at it. I said, well, John, what was taking you so long? Yes, I'd love to come look at it. And so we go and tour around this building. John is not a salesman, but boy, is he selling. Like, we could do this over here and paint this wall this way. Wouldn't this be great? We finish that tour, and I look at John, just like heavy-hearted, like, John, I cannot see any software developer ever coming to this place and volunteering to stay. Like, I do not see it. Like, and he said, no, and John, benevolent to a fault, like, totally get it. There is no pressure at all. Just wanted you to see this building because, we could give it to you for free. And I said, John, this is the building. And like, so like, that is, we had all 3 things, but let's not over glorify like what we actually had. We had the day 1 version of all 3 things. And so as we think about things today, by way of example, on day 1, we're thinking about supportive services for students, but mostly we're thinking about like, how could we be nice to them? Like, how could we make sure that like, we're not jerks in the way that they might experience in an online program, or that we're not just sort of flippantly taking their tuition and not caring about the human being. What can we do that allows folks from diverse backgrounds to track into this work? That was our thinking. Today, we're thinking about, well, how can we redefine public transit in our city so that people that are distributed at the edges of our county and are the poorest can get to the center and access these things? How can we deliver, commercialize, and then make that something that is sustainable? Today, on the infrastructure side, so on our physical footprint, we're thinking about what are the exact mix of food, retail, third space options that would complement the communities we're trying to reach and serve in the work that we're doing. And how can we stand that up? And maybe we keep it and we operate it. Maybe we stand it up and we hand it off to a local operator, somebody who wouldn't otherwise have the chance. And so there are a great many of these things that we're thinking about in broadening the existing categories, I would say, rather than getting into new ones. And so that work continues today. And it feels pretty privileged to be in a spot where we have the resources to fill gaps that sort of put gas in the tank to keep on the core mission.
I think we've got 3 questions lined up. I think Luciano, you are next. After Luciano, there will be Harsh has a question, and then after Harsh, it is Jay. Go, Luciano.
Thank you. It's kind of related to Lara's question. Kind of curious, kind of rolling back to your Series A pitch. When you were pitching, typically, it's my understanding you want to pitch for some milestone or things you want to implement. What were those for you when you were pitching? We want to use this money to do what? And then after you got the money, you started to implement. What changed? Like, what new information or new learning occurred that maybe changed course? Can you share a little bit about that before and after?
Yeah, so we raised our Series A on a premise of expanding to 3 additional cities and driving additional growth in our technology companies and the things that were implicit in that. The nuances of that changed almost entirely. So yes, we did those things, but they changed almost completely. And venture investors are really fond of telling you, like, hey, when you come back to raise your Series B, we're going to ask you about whether you did this stuff in your Series A. They are lying. They care about just a small set of things. They care about, do they emotionally connect with this? Can you double year over year? And can you draw a straight line to being $1 billion company? That's it. And do I believe those things? You could literally make e-cigarettes that help more kids smoke. I'm telling a true story here, and raise $1 kajillion. It doesn't matter. If you can tell them a story that it's going to be $1 billion, you're going to trace that. You're going to find an investor. And so what I would encourage is, how do you tell the story of what you want to do in a way that is truthful and authentic, but falls into their rows and columns. And because again, they're not going to say, hey, Luciano has this great company. I've decided I'm going to change the way I do due diligence. Like I'm doing things differently from now on. He's so great that I don't believe in venture capital anymore. Never going to happen. Not in any time horizon that's interesting to you. And so you've got to fall into their rows and columns. And you need to be able to explain what you do in a way you understand, and draw a straight line to becoming $1 billion company, doubling year over year along the way.
Awesome. I love these candid insights. Harsh, I think you're up next.
Okay, thanks so much. That was very nice to hear from you. What would you say were the 3 top most convincing points for your investors to have invested in you? That's my first question. And the second question was, would you start, or what would be your advice for entrepreneurs? Did you start with a 1-page executive summary, or did you start with a deck for these investors? Would you like to talk a little bit about your initial communication with these investors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of the 3 most important things, I would, maybe leave wanting there. I'll give you 2, and the one is alignment, right? Does this investor, have they expressed a commitment, a desire to invest in this category? And then 2, once you've met them, did they like you? And this is where, we all have varying degrees of emotional intelligence, but they are not going to invest in you if they don't like you. There is an emotional connection that will happen or not happen. And if it doesn't happen, stop investing in the relationship. And there are exceptions to this rule. Again, if you have this astronaut company and that makes electric cars, and you get to be a kind of crazy jerk, like that's an exception to the rule. But the rule is that you have to be liked by them. There has to be that emotional connection, or it's not going to get off of first base. Your second question, I seriously wish that I had this information going out. We had the information going out to raise. What you need is absolutely, in terms of materials, absolutely predefined, canned, non-negotiable. You need a deck, and your deck it cannot be like, you might think you've got a better idea for a deck. Doesn't matter. You got to do it the way they want you to do it. And there is I think Guy Kawasaki, I think that's the name. I might be butchering his name. He's very successful, but that is the model that we used loosely. I mean, it's very difficult to couch Bitwise in those terms. And I'm happy to pull a link even as we're here and share that out. It's like the first thing that comes up if you go venture capital pitch deck and then search Guy, that will come up. Or Guy K. It's a really good model. I would encourage you to use it. And that matters a great deal. And you can win cheap points, like making it pretty. It actually matters. And so I think having that dialed is really, really important. And here's another thing that is I think really important in that. Your deck, you shouldn't think of it as a complete sentence. Like if I stood here and I said, I Jake, right? And I stop. Like that's awkward. That's weird. Like we feel obligated to have complete sentences when we're talking to each other. That's not what we're doing with a deck. What we're trying to do is provoke a meeting. And so you provoke a meeting by giving them the information in the rows and columns they asked for, and sparking their interest. They want to look at that and they want to know more about you, about what you're doing, about how you did it. So that would be piece number 2. And then piece number 3, I don't know if it's piece number 2 or 3, I've lost count. But the is your data room. This was something that I lost more nights trying to do this fast with that. Oh yeah, we're raising our Series A. Oh yeah, sure, our data room is ready. Go home, Google search data room. But a data room, there are a number of service providers out there that do this. It is basically Google Drive with more intense password protection. And there is a preset list of things that you need to have in that data room, and then you dish out access to it, and you could see when they've accessed it. We've always used Digify; it's been just fine. So the Dropbox, I would not recommend Dropbox. I don't mean to be disagreeable in any way. The reason I wouldn't recommend Dropbox is because it's not what they're expecting. Like, they are so lazy. I love them, some of them, but like I would really recommend, like, off the shelf. What does conventional white guy use? Pick that one. And that data room, you can find a number of different really good resources online that list out what the files are, what the sub files should be. At a minimum, you want to have your deck in there. You want to have a financials folder, and you want to give them current year to date and next and most recent prior 3 years. And you want to have some legal docs. You can find that inventory, have that ready. Why do I say have that ready? Why is it so important? Because you want to get their attention. You want to, with a deck, you want to have a meeting, and you want to literally be walking out of that meeting in a time when we went to meetings, or hanging up on the Zoom, and you want to zip over your data room and your deck again, because you have their attention, and being able to strike in that way is really, really important. And so those things are really critical. From there, I would encourage, don't do anything else. Wait until 2 or 3 people have asked for the same thing before deciding to create a new thing, because otherwise you have this massive sprawl, and you've created enormous amounts of information that are sort of unhelpful. And then by your second raise, you get to a spot where you have you sort of knew what worked for you, and you sort of kind of can stay in those lanes. And so we produce an impact report with our raises. We produce a breakout on a couple of different pieces of our model and an update on that as a part of our standard set of materials. But there would have been no way for us to knowing that would have been the effective piece on day one. Deck, data room.
Great advice. Jay, you're up, and after Jay will be Chris.
Thank you for that. I was wondering if you have any advice for new entrepreneurs, maybe more on emotional level. And have you ever encountered feeling you want to work for someone else instead of being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what I'd encourage here is we tend to over time develop, to varying levels of maturity, a sense of like what a healthy version of us is and how we get to that thing. And then entrepreneurship is one of these endeavors where we say, yes, I know what that is, but I'm going to do none of those things for a while and pretend it's okay. And so we just point the car straight at the cliff, pedal to the metal, and just hope that we're not going to break at some point. And it's a fallacy. And so in terms of that emotional health, I think the things that are healthy practices, do not let your entrepreneurial journey convince you that those are optional. They're not. It is a long race, and you can't be in the race unless you are healthy and alive. And so I think is super important. And I benefit, like here, it's this amazing luxury to have founded a company with Irma, and then subsequently our sort of the third member of our executive team is Bethany Milley, our president, and been deeply committed to each other's emotional health along the way, such that, because somebody, I remember when we first started, walked in, it was this guy I sort of knew from in the community, and he had this pitch to be my executive coach. Like, you're going to need this, like, and for a small fee, I can help you. I thought the pitch was awful, but he said something to me in that meeting that has rung so true. Perhaps I should have hired him. Perhaps I should send him a check. But he said, what is going to happen next, if you're successful, is you will become terribly lonely. And here's what, and he said, because here's what happens. You can't tell your wife about how hard it is, or your partner, whomever, because you don't want them to worry. You can't tell your team about how hard it is because you want them to think you have it all together. you can't tell your investor how hard it is because you want them to keep giving you money. You can't tell your competitor how hard it is because you think that they're just looking for an opportunity to slide a knife in your back, right? And so it's this isolating experience. And absent having Irma and Beth as partners in this work, I think that I'm not sure that I would have sustained in the way that I have. And owe a debt of gratitude to them. And I think they would say the same thing. And so there, I would. You've got to have a couple of people you tell all the ugly stuff to, and know what healthy you looks like, and have permission to raise their hand when you're not there.
Great.
Thank you.
Chris Schultz, you had your hand up, but it's since been lowered. Do you still have a question?
It actually, Jake answered my question in the last answer, so I'll pass.
Oh, awesome. Okay. See how good you're doing there, Jake? You're answering multiple questions. I don't see any other hands up, any other questions. I've got some still. Anybody want to pipe in real quick? If not,
I have one.
go
I think I put it in your question list too. So Jake, when I first heard that you were CEO of Bitwise, I'm like, wait, Irma's CEO of Bitwise. And then I went and looked you guys up, and you're co-CEOs, co-founders and co-CEOs. And that's an unusual arrangement. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that and why you guys decided to set things up that way.
Yeah, it is an unusual arrangement. And really there was nothing external that drove that. It was, we thought, an authentic expression of the way that we lead, and the right way to situate sort of that leadership for the benefit of Bitwise, in that it is truly like there are no decisions that are completely Irma or completely Jake, and we have this unique. We have a really unique relationship that has worked now for some time, and it is born of mutual admiration, love, trust of the other, and what that's done is I would say that you have this circumstance now where it's a bit like folks who have been playing basketball together for a while, and you're able to pass and just know the person will be there, and so our role as co-CEOs, I think, works because of that reality. And if that didn't exist, and want to note, there was an article run here in Fresno recently about there's a couple of co-CEOs now in the community, and do you think this is a good idea? And my reaction to that was no, I would not say everybody should be starting a company with a co-CEO. But if you're sitting in a spot and you sort of just have this magic, don't bother trying to sort of define it or put it in traditional boxes. Put it in the boxes that keep it magic. And for us, that was working as co-CEOs. It is something we've been criticized for. That's another thing that if you want to fall in the right rows and columns of venture capital, don't do that. That is not, you're going to get beat up for that. How do you sort out conflict? And I think that we've been able to get over those objections because our working relationship is truly special, and it is it's evident if you see us interact together. I will say on one side of the coin, there are a great many people say, I'm not sure about that guy, but she's great. And I think together there's something very good there. And with that, another note on success, if that's a road folks consider, is we do internally have very clear leadership portfolios, and we stay off of each other's lawn. So it's not to say that Irma can't wander over and weigh in on things. It's that's in Jake's leadership portfolio. And so there is a way that we deal with that, and that is through Jake. And she's not powerless in that setting, but we sort of honor those lines so we're not always stepping over all over each other's toes.
Great. Any other questions? We've got about, we'll be wrapping it up in about 10 to 15 minute time frame. So if you don't have a question yet, start thinking of them. So I'm going to ask one question I often ask over the last 10 months or so. COVID, pivots due to COVID, going remote. And I think you had 2 initiatives that came out of that, a digital New Deal and Onward US. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. COVID is many things. It has been, 2020 was very, very challenging. I think, obvious from my description of the company is place is really critical. Community is really critical. And that was in the senses that in the ways that we enjoyed it pre-COVID, turned off in an instant. And then there's the dual reality of, living in Fresno, a pretty conservative city, at least from its view of itself and its power structure. There was additional tension in that, like we're saying, yeah, obviously we're going to send our employees home to be safe for as long as it takes. And many in our city were still sort of in denial or opposition to the reality of the moment. And so there were certainly difficulties. For us, one of the things, when you fancy yourself as having a role in saving the world, sort of there's not a moment where you don't have something to do. And for us, it was, okay, we are excellent at enterprise technology. We are excellent at raising up a next generation of talent. And in this moment, there are quite a lot of emergency technology needs. And there are quite a lot of people who have all of a sudden become unemployed in the drop of a hat, and uniquely unemployed in that it's not as though their job's coming back. And so that gave way to two things that were really sort of wonderful silver linings in our 2020 story, in the way of being opportunities to serve. And the first of those is an initiative we launched in partnership with the Cape War Center, Schmidt Futures, MasterCard, Zoma Labs, a number of others, that called Onward. It initially began as Onward CA, where in 11 days we stood up a statewide platform to connect folks who had lost their jobs to life essential services. So how are you going to get food? Where are you going to stay if you're out of a place to live? Where are you going to get childcare? On and on. The things that you need to just survive, to jobs, to training, and to jobs, so that you could immediately begin hopping down the lily pads in a web-based setting towards getting back to gainful employment, the sort of job that would allow you to take care of yourself and those that you support. And that in 11 days stood up. We thought we'd serve 1,000 people in the first month. We served 100,000 people in the first 24 hours. Wow. And then it sort of exploded and is now in 15 states doing that work. And it allowed us to engage with a lot of awesome partners, a lot of state governments. And so we did good with no model for making money on that. And the net effect of that is we have been able to, from a business development standpoint, sell to easily 10x the number of new customers that we had anticipated for 2020, because we met in this context of service, developed trust, and then we're invited to be a part of other things going on in those spaces. So that's one. And the other is, I shared that apprenticeship is at our core. We've gotten a chance now to partner with the state of California, and very likely some others to come online here soon, to launch a statewide apprenticeship program called the Digital New Deal, where we're taking government software development work, and we are allocating it to be executed in a model that raises up apprentices. And so taking folks who have been displaced, unemployed, underemployed as a result of COVID, channeling them through our apprenticeship programs. They're in a pair programming setting, delivering on government software development work. The government gets both the technology work product and the future tech workforce with folks ready to re-enter the economy in a more prosperous place. And so that work has been really, really exciting, and is just now launching under that banner here in California and readying in other states as well. But it's an extension of our core work of apprenticeship tailored to this moment.
And can people find out more information about all those programs on your website?
So Digital New Deal it will be something that folks will find on the website here. There's some big announcements coming up in February. And so that will go on there in February. And then the work about Onward US, so you can find it onwardus.org. And that will track you to any of the states that are participating, and a description of the initiative and the tool itself, which is completely free.
And just before I forget, what is your website? How can people find out more about Bitwise?
Bitwiseindustries.com. Yeah. And you can track around to the different pieces and parts and some really fun stories. And yeah, so and should be able to track out even to onward from there.
Awesome. So we're running kind of coming up on time. I don't see any other questions, so I want to kind of wrap it up with, I've got two questions in mind. And the first one I think is, what's next in 2021 for you and for Bitwise?
Yeah, so I don't want to be too cagey, but we've got a big announcement coming up in February that will result in some additional exciting growth. And so keep an eye out for that. Extensions, really exciting extensions of the work that we've described as already being in motion. And I think that, Irma and I are really eager to be more direct with this, what is our closing argument, if you will, and that is this notion of, we said as a tech economy in several different iterations. Pre-2020, we talked about diversity and inclusion. 2020, we talk about justice and the need for racial equity and the like. Companies have invested billions of dollars in diversity and inclusion, and we have not moved the needle. And the reality of that, to our mind, is that one of two things have to be true. We are either very, very bad at this, or we are lying, and that we are not actually interested in diversity and inclusion. And so we want to orient a lot of our work in 2020 around being very direct with that message in the rooms we've all of a sudden been invited into. There's something about raising capital that all of a sudden you're in the Mickey Mouse Club, right? I will say raising your second round of capital, infinitely easier. And so there is hope. But the being in those rooms, there are two choices. The choice is like, hey, like, I've got the Patagonia vest now. Like I know all the fancy, firms, and like we're doing business with the logos. And so like, act the part, like you're going to get your turn to be a billionaire here in a minute. Like, just stay the course, and do things, talk the way we talk, don't upset the apple cart. Other option is sort of still being authentically about the message you showed up with, and being courageous enough to say, like, the way it's working in this room is broken. And it might have accidentally benefited us, but it is not benefiting the majority, and we really want to change that.
Okay, I see Luciana's one. Luciana, you'll be the last question, but I want to ask this one first. As a social impact entrepreneur, what would you say to other entrepreneurs here on the call to encourage them to really focus on addressing societal problems and making a social impact? And maybe changing from developing something that's not socially driven to focus on societal impact?
I don't know if my advice would be like a fundamental change to fit into the category of social impact. I think my advice would be to be constantly asking, what is the actual net effect of your work? And is it a positive an obvious positive for the planet? Because if it's not an obvious positive for the planet, then you're doing this for money, and we might as well be honest about it. And is that enough? For some it is, for us it isn't. And I think if we're being really direct, like, we don't think it should be enough for anybody. And so there's some really folks who speak really artfully about this. Mitch and Frida Kapor are some. The folks at Acumen America are others. Morgan Simon has a book called, she's an investor of the Candide Group, called Real Impact, that speak really, really eloquently about this specific point of, you have a social impact. Do you know what it is? And are you comfortable with that? Are you proud of that? And it doesn't matter if you're building B2B SaaS, treat people well, hire people that don't look like you, and now you're a social impact company. And so that lens has a role, I think, in each of our businesses.
And great, Luciana's got a nice segue question for that. So, Luciana, you want to jump in, and you'll be the last question, then we'll wrap it up with some announcements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very related. I mean, how did you describe the role and importance of impact in your pitch? And I mean, maybe how did it weave into your story, or was it part of your story in the pitch, and how did you navigate the different expectations from different investors that you encountered?
Yeah, so we were very upfront about it. Is that we, in our Series A, I believe the tagline was that we were activating human potential in underdog cities around the country, and it feels now very fuzzy. The most recent description of our work from an impact standpoint literally just got right to it. Thousands of Black and brown, low-income human beings invited to the party in the technology industry. This is the path for rebuilding generative and equitable economies in underdog cities across America. So we wear it on our sleeve. It is our distinction. And I think that again, that's not the textbook advice, but our social argument is our argument. That is our business. You can't do Bitwise without doing equity or justice unless you're doing it wrong. And that's not, I think, essentially true for every company in terms of the way that you pitch your company from the jump.
Great. Jake, I want to thank you. Great advice, great stories. Really appreciate you coming all the way to Sacramento this evening and sharing your stories, sharing about Bitwise and the social impact. Awesome stuff. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you.
And so that's it. I want to thank everybody else for coming out. Also, we are going to, as you've seen, we were recording this event, so we will be sending out a recording of that event. We typically send out an email to every registered on Eventbrite sometime probably early next week with that link to that video, with the video, so you can catch up on all this great advice and whatnot. I do want to let everybody know that our next save the date for the next startup happy hour, which is February 23rd. And we will be welcoming Jonte James, who is the CTO of NatureTrack. And I believe that Laura is pasting in the link into the Eventbrite registration link into the chat box. Go, Laura. Yay, there it is. Awesome, everybody. So we hope everybody got a lot out of this tonight. We got another great speaker lined up in February. Thank you all for coming. Stay safe, stay well, and good night, everybody.